There are very few brands in the world that people actually tattoo on their skin. Apple is in your pocket, Nike is on your shoes, but Harley-Davidson, Harley is on your arm, on your back, on your leather jacket. It's not just a motorcycle. It's a scream of freedom, a symbol of rebellion, and, for a lot of people, it's part of who they are. But here's the twist. This same brand that became a global identity once came dangerously close to collapsing. So, how did Harley-Davidson transform from a struggling manufacturer with quality problems into the ultimate symbol of freedom on two wheels? Today, Harley-Davidson is one of the most iconic motorcycle brands on the planet. Its bikes appear in movies, TV shows, music videos, and its fans cross entire countries just to attend official Harley events. Instead of selling only engines and horsepower, Harley sells belonging, the sound of the motor, the open road, that feeling of, I don't follow the rules, I make my own rules. And understanding how Harley got here is understanding one of the biggest secrets in modern branding, how to turn a product into an identity. In this story, we'll see how Harley was born in a small backyard workshop in Milwaukee, how it almost lost everything in the 70s and 80s, and how it decided to stop selling motorcycles and start selling who you believe you are when you ride one. To understand why Harley-Davidson became almost a religion, we need to go back more than 100 years. At the beginning of the 20th century in Milwaukee, in the United States, 4 young men, including William Harley and Arthur Davidson, started building motorcycles in a small shed behind a house. There was no glamour, no sophisticated marketing. It was basically improvised engineering, dirty hands, and the desire to build machines that were faster and tougher than the motorized bicycles of that time. But the world was about to become a lot more violent, and that's when Harley gained something no advertising campaign could ever buy: legitimacy. During World War I, the U.S. Army ordered thousands of Harley-Davidson motorcycles for communication, transport, and reconnaissance missions. In World War II, the story repeated itself. Harley bikes were again on the front lines in rough terrain, side by side, with soldiers who risked their lives every single day. That created a powerful association. Harley wasn't just a motorcycle. It was the motorcycle of soldiers, of tough people, of those who could take a hit and keep going. Resilience, courage, patriotism, all of that became attached to the brand long before anyone used the word branding. When the war ended, thousands of veterans came back home used to the feeling of freedom on two wheels. Many of them didn't want to just buy a car, sit in traffic, and live a neat, quiet suburban life. They wanted the road, the wind in their face, and that feeling that they were still in control of their own destiny. In this context, motorcycle clubs began to grow, with groups organizing around the bike and the lifestyle. Leather jackets, patches, group rides, meetups at roadside bars, unwritten codes of honor and belonging. Harley became the uniform of this tribe. Hollywood noticed that very quickly. Movies like Easy Rider and many others turned the lone biker on the open road into the ultimate symbol of rebellion, freedom, and I don't fit into your system. And in many of those movies, the silhouette and the sound of the bike were Harley. At this point, something crucial happened. Harley-Davidson stopped being just a motorcycle manufacturer and started becoming the emblem of a way of life. People buying a Harley weren't just buying a vehicle. They were buying a story about themselves. The problem was, while Harley's image was getting stronger and stronger on the outside, inside the company, it was heading toward one of the worst crises in its history. While Harley-Davidson was celebrated on the highways and glorified on movie screens, a much less glamorous story was unfolding inside its factories and offices. In the 1970s, the motorcycle world changed pace. Japanese brands, Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, Kawasaki, started flooding the market with bikes that were lighter, more modern, more reliable, and often cheaper. Meanwhile, Harley was struggling with serious quality problems. Oil leaks, mechanical issues, questionable finishes. The cruel joke was that if you bought a Harley, it came with a toolkit, because you were going to need it. Under pressure to produce more and compete on volume, Harley-Davidson was acquired by a conglomerate called AMF. On paper, that should have brought resources, efficiency, and scale. In practice, it brought something very dangerous, a mass production mindset applied to a brand that depended on authenticity and care. The obsession with quantity instead of quality slowly eroded Harley's reputation. True fans began to feel that the brand they loved was becoming just another industrial product. No soul, no attention to detail, no respect for the rider's experience. At the same time, Japanese motorcycles were gaining market share with smoother engines, less vibration, fewer defects, more technology. For the average consumer, the choice was obvious: a modern, reliable, affordable motorcycle, or a more expensive Harley with a growing reputation for mechanical problems. By the 1980s, the situation was critical. Sales were falling, factories were under threat, and jokes about Harley's reliability circulated among riders themselves. Harley-Davidson, the icon of freedom and rebellion, was getting dangerously close to something that once seemed impossible: disappearing. That's when a decisive move happened behind the scenes. A group of executives from inside the company came together to buy Harley back from AMF. They believed there was still something worth saving: the myth, the story, the community. This management buyout wasn't just a financial deal. It was almost a rescue mission for the brand's soul. From that moment on, the priority stopped being push as many bikes as possible into the market and became rebuild trust, quality, and most importantly, the meaning of being Harley. And those executives understood something fundamental. Harley could never beat the Japanese brands on raw technology. So instead of trying to copy their competitors, they decided to bet on something much more intangible and much more powerful, turning the brand itself into the real product. This is where Harley-Davidson begins its transformation from a motorcycle manufacturer into a factory of identity. When the new owners took back control of Harley-Davidson, they knew tightening a few bolts wasn't going to be enough. What was at stake wasn't just the mechanics, it was the myth. The first mission was obvious, but tough: rebuild quality. For real. Review processes, tighten controls, cut down the defects that had become a running joke in the market. But at the same time, they realized something important. Harley didn't need to, and maybe shouldn't, try to become just another smooth, quiet, perfect motorcycle like many of the Japanese models. What some people called flaws, the noise, the vibration, the engine you feel in your chest, could be transformed into a signature. Instead of competing only in technology, Harley decided to compete in meaning. A clear strategy emerged. Harley-Davidson wouldn't just sell vehicles, it would sell a feeling, a story, an identity. The brand embraced its own aesthetic: heavy bikes, lots of chrome, classic lines, and that unmistakable V-twin engine sound you recognize from far away, even with your back turned. It wasn't a product for everyone. It was for people who wanted to make a statement about themselves every time they turned the key. But turning Harley into an identity required more than good advertising. It required community. That's where the HOG, the Harley Owners Group, comes in. Instead of treating bike buyers just as customers, Harley started treating them as members of a global club. Official events, rallies, group rides, hats, patches, vests, pins, everything reinforced the idea that if you own a Harley, you're not alone. You're part of a tribe. Dealerships also changed their role. They stopped being just places to buy or fix bikes and started acting as gathering spots, almost like temples of the brand. Clothing stores, accessories, home items, coffee areas, event spaces. Even people who didn't own a Harley could walk in, feel the atmosphere, imagine themselves in that world, and often walk out with a jacket, a cap, or at least a desire planted in their mind. Gradually, The Harley-Davidson logo started appearing on t-shirts, mugs, lighters, stickers, and on something even more extreme, people's skin. The Harley tattoo became one of the ultimate symbols of loyalty. It was no longer just, "I like this bike." It was, "This says who I am." All of this turned Harley into something rare in business, a brand that doesn't depend only on product specs, but on what it represents in the collective imagination. But that strategy has a dark side, because when a brand is so deeply tied to ideas like freedom, rebellion, and tradition, changing the product can feel to many fans almost like a betrayal. And that's exactly the dilemma Harley faces today. How to stay relevant for new generations in a world talking about cities, sustainability, and the future of mobility, without losing the soul that made it an icon in the first place. When you look at Harley-Davidson's story, one thing becomes very clear. It did something very few brands ever achieve. It escaped the category of product and entered the category of identity. That's the first big insight. Brands that manage to represent who you are have a power that goes far beyond price, specs, or discounts. When someone buys a Harley, they're not just choosing a way to get from A to B. They're choosing a narrative for their life. Freedom, the open road, rebellion, authenticity. But there's a second, more uncomfortable point, that strength can become a trap. When a brand's identity is built around tradition, noise, gasoline, leather, the highway, any move toward change, like electric bikes, new formats, new audiences, can be seen by fans as a threat. Harley has to innovate to survive. But it can't innovate so much that it looks like it betrayed its own tribe. That balance is delicate. And it's the kind of tension every cult brand eventually has to face. The third insight is about community. Harley understood, long before many others, that its greatest asset wasn't the factory or even the catalog of models. It was the community, the owners groups, the rallies, the shared symbols, the rituals, the stories told on the road. When a brand becomes a flag, people carry, defend, and even tattoo on their bodies, it gets a much larger margin for error than its competitors. But that comes with a responsibility. Maintaining that trust requires consistency, respect, and a deep understanding that what's at stake is not just the product. It's the identity of the people who chose that brand to represent them. And Harley-Davidson is not alone in this kind of challenge. Every time a brand steps into territory that is almost cultural, it stops fighting just for market share and starts fighting for meaning. And that's exactly what's happening on another battlefield, coffee. Because if building a brand that becomes an identity is already hard, entering a culture where that identity has existed for centuries can be disastrous. In our next episode, we're going to see what happens when a global coffee and lifestyle giant decides to enter one of the country's most proud and protective of its own coffee culture. The title says it all. Starbucks in Italy, a cultural disaster waiting to happen. How does a brand famous for turning coffee into an experience try to win over a people who never needed anyone to teach them what a good espresso is? If you want to follow that story and more battles between brands and culture, make sure you subscribe to Brand Stories and Big Ideas and turn on notifications. And now, a question. Would you ever tattoo a brand on your skin? And in your opinion, is Harley-Davidson managing to reinvent itself without losing its soul? Or is it too trapped in its own myth? Let us know in the comments and get ready for the next story. Starbucks versus Italy.